Hey everyone, hopefully you're having a good day. I wanted to make a follow-up video to my last one about these mRNA vaccines because there's been some concern about the safety of these vaccines, and rightfully so. You know, these new things we're always worried about. So to understand the safety of these vaccines, you need to go back and understand how mRNA is actually made. I know I talked about the way we make the antibodies in the vaccine, but mRNA is actually a final product. You got to remember that RNA is like a wide term. There's all sorts of different types of RNA, and mRNA is just one type. So where it begins is actually from the nucleus. This is the DNA, and some machinery called these polymerizes. They kind of like attach to the DNA, they split it open, and they start making RNA. They start to transcribe this into RNA, and you get this long strand. But this isn't the final product. This is just kind of like a preliminary product that has to go through a bunch of processing. So inside the nucleus, the long strand hnRNA goes into like a factory that we call the spliceosome. And inside the spliceosome is all sorts of like machinery, I guess you can call it. These small RNPs, which are called the ribonuclear proteins, which are proteins plus RNA. And they kind of chop it up. So they start chopping it up and they discard a bunch of pieces that they don't need. And then you get this final product here called pre-mRNA. Now the pre-mRNA still needs to go through some processing because you have another factory called the ribosome, right? And those are outside of the nucleus, inside the cytoplasm, made of these subunits. Needs to recognize this to say, hey, we need to make protein. So the pre-mRNA needs to go through what's called a capping process. And in the 5' end, you don't really need to know this, but the 5' end, one of the sides, they put a cap on there. And on the other side, they put something called a poly-A tail. Again, you don't really need to know that, but it's just these like little segments there. And in the middle of it is the code that they want to, make the protein from. And then some segments that aren't really read. They're just kind of like non-translated or transcribed. They're just kind of hanging out there. They serve a purpose, which we're not too sure of yet. And it's very complicated, so I won't go into it. But anyway, that is the final product of mRNA. And the beauty of these vaccines is that they only introduce this portion. They don't introduce it anywhere earlier in the process where, things could go wrong, even though the cell is really good at doing this. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a lot of life forms if they couldn't form a protein properly. So they introduced this final product, and this final product can only be read by the ribosome. So the ribosome sees this and says, hey, I know this. It's mRNA. And then it just starts to bring in amino acids, and tRNA comes in here. Amino acids, they come in here, and they start to churn out a protein. The protein finally gets folded up. Look at this beautiful protein here. And in the case of these COVID vaccines, the spike protein is made, and then we have the response that we want to get from my other video if you want to watch that. All right, guys. So again, it's pretty safe in this sense. There's always the fear of our own body reacting to these vaccines, just like any other vaccine. The biggest reactions are allergic reactions. Even like the scariest one that we think about, like Guillain-Barré syndrome with the flu vaccine, is like an autoimmune type reaction. That's the scariest thing. And of course, unfortunately, that's the nature until our technology advances to be able to make the safest, 100% safe vaccines. All right, guys. So hopefully that answers some questions, and have a good night. Peace.